美国之音白宫记者黄耀义来介绍。耀义。
是这份价值520亿美元的芯片法案当中呢，要投资美国的半导体的产业，不过呢也设下了某些的限制，包括设下护栏来确保包括中国等敌手不会受益于这些的投资。那么在7月18号的白宫新闻简报会上，白宫发言人尚皮耶就表示，白宫是强力支持对中国设下这些护栏。我们看一下白宫发言人是怎么说的。
The CHIPS Act is intended to bolster American competitiveness and our own domestic supply chain security. That's why we continue to support strong guardrails, as you're alluding to there, Jenny, which also have bipartisan support in Congress to make sure CHIPS incentives generate more semiconductor investment here in the U.S., not in China. And guardrails help slow the growth of investment in China. That is why such an important part of the bill. It is such an important part of the bill, and we believe in strong guardrails.
根据《华尔街日报》的报道呢，这个参议院当中的多数党领袖民主党的舒默参议员提出的草案当中，还特别设下说要避免拿到这个美国补助金的公司到中国设厂，或是扩建他们在中国所拥有的先进半导体厂，或者是到其他不友善国家来设立半导体厂。那么目前呢，我们知道，包括世界最大的晶圆制造商台积电，还有这个第3大的台湾环球晶圆都已经在美国设厂，还有这个英特尔呢，现在也是要扩建工厂。不过这些大的晶圆厂都在观望，也就是要美国国会通过这个芯片法案，才会来提供足够的投资的诱因。那么在这个星期一的白宫新闻简报会上呢，白宫经济委员会的委员伯恩斯坦表示，根据之前的版本呢，他相信参议院当中现在至少有68票会投下赞成票。那么此外呢，针对于中国的关税，白宫发言人尚皮也表示呢，特朗普时期实施的关税并没有效率。不过呢，由于中国并没有达到他们的这个贸易上的承诺，所以现在拜登政府内部呢也持续的讨论针对中国关税的各种选项。不过呢，目前还没有到能够公布的时机。卡拉，
好的，感谢耀义从白宫带来的报道。 美国财政部长耶伦抵达韩国，他将发表政策演讲，呼吁盟国深化贸易关系，以巩固供应链，应对通胀，并且遏阻中国的不公平贸易行为。这是他为期11天的印太行程的最后一站。他周二将参观韩国最大的企业之一科技巨头 LG 公司的设施。LG 最近宣布在美国投资电动车电池的制造。 耶伦在飞往韩国的途中表示，美国希望终结对来自中国的稀土、太阳能板和其他关键产品的过分依赖，防止北京像对其他国家那样切断供应。 乌克兰总统泽连斯基星期天下令解除乌克兰国家安全局长伊万·巴卡诺夫和乌克兰总检察长伊琳娜·维内迪克托娃的职务，称在这2人任职的部门出现了数百起涉嫌叛国或通俄的刑事案件。泽连斯基表示，乌克兰安全官员中目前有超过650起涉嫌叛国和通俄的案子在接受调查。 巴卡诺夫和维内迪克托娃2人被开除，是俄军入侵乌克兰以来基辅发生的最大的人事变动。自从俄军入侵乌克兰以来，巴卡诺夫一直因为乌克兰安全遭遇的破坏而受到越来越多的批评。同时遭到撤换的总检察长维内迪克托娃负责对俄罗斯战争罪行的调查。 美国司法部星期一公开了对纽约长岛2名居民的刑事起诉，指控他们涉嫌共谋一起涉案金额达2700万美元的投资欺诈，向外国人兜售与美国总统及其他知名政治人物接触与合影的机会，并且为竞选活动提供非法捐款。2名被告已于当日被逮捕。 根据刑事诉状，李雪芮和王连波向美国境外的投资者谎称，他们正在开发一个名为汤普森教育中心的项目，投资者可以通过投资这个项目获得美国的EB5投资绿卡。司法部说，截至今年7月，有超过150名投资者向这个项目投资了至少2700万美元，但是都没有获得临时或永久绿卡。 投资者的部分资金被挪作他用，包括支付房屋贷款、度假旅行和政治捐款等个人开支。刑事诉状还说，李雪芮和王连波还向外国人兜售与美国知名政治人物接触和合影的机会，利用他们在2017年在募捐活动上与时任美国总统特朗普的合影作为营销工具，继续从外国人那里骗取汤普森教育中心项目的投资。欢迎继续收看《美国观察》。美国前国防部长埃斯珀周一率团抵达台湾访问，并将会见蔡英文总统。埃斯珀不久前在接受美国之音的专访时表示，美国需要重新审视一中政策。美国在台湾问题上的立场也应该从战略模糊转向战略清晰。在专访中，埃斯珀还谈到了如果美国改变对台政策，是否会引发美中军事冲突，而在可能的军事冲突威胁下，美台又应该如何应对等问题。
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for speaking with Voice America today. I would like to start with your take on President Biden's recent remarks on Taiwan. A couple of days ago in Tokyo, he indicated that the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily if China attempts to take Taiwan by force. White House officials walked back the remark, later saying the president was only promising U.S. aid to help Taiwan defend itself. And then President Biden himself clarified that the U.S. hasn't changed its strategic policy on Taiwan. Do you think it's just, President Biden misspoke a little bit, or it's indicating that the administration is seriously considering ending its strategic ambiguity on Taiwan?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with Voice of America today, so thank you very much. Look, I think President Biden's remark was very important. It, in my view, constitutes a change in policy. It's not the first time he said it. It's, in fact, the third time. And it's also the third time that the White House tried to walk it back and explain it away, which is confounding to me and many others. Look, I've said before that I think that the one China policy in the decades since relationships were changed in the 1970s has run its course, that Taiwan and China have developed and evolved in different ways that now warrants a new approach, a new policy. And I think that there's less ambiguity today than there was before with regard to whether or not the United States would defend Taiwan. So I think President Biden made a clear statement. Now, of course, he doesn't get into the details of whether that means troops or just logistical support or whatnot, but he wouldn't be able to offer that anyways. It all depends on the situation and what else is happening at the time. But I view it as a policy change. I think it is warranted, and I give him credit for making such a bold statement.
In your newly published book, Sacred Oath, you argue that the time has come for the U.S. to review its one China policy. Are you suggesting an end to the strategic ambiguity on Taiwan?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to move beyond ambiguity to clarity. And by the way, I wrote the book a year ago. It's just now coming out after DoD reviews and whatnot. And my view is, given the situation in the Taiwan Strait and the fact, frankly, that China's approach toward Taiwan has been very threatening. We've seen over the last several years, we've seen Chinese naval and air movements into Taiwanese airspace. And we've seen heated rhetoric. So, look, they are not abiding but by a core foundation of one China policy and at least the Taiwan Relations Act and communiques, which basically said that all parties agreed to that the future of Taiwan should be resolved peacefully. And by the way, in the Taiwan Relations Act, as I recall, the law actually states that we're either party to try and address the future of Taiwan in an unpeaceful means, and we would consider that a grave security threat, which implies that there would be a U.S. military role.
But given the strong reaction from Beijing, is it possible to change the U.S. policy on Taiwan without provoking armed conflict with the PRC?
Well, that's a challenge, and that's a challenge I wrote about in my book. My preference would be that a change in policy not be done through a press conference, but rather it first be done behind closed doors with our greatest partners and allies in the region, that it be coordinated, for example, with Tokyo and Seoul and with Australia and the Philippines and others, and that it come out in a more deliberate manner with providing sufficient strategic context, explaining the reasons behind the change and so on. And so that's kind of what I argued for in my book, a more thoughtful approach, a more deliberate and a more coordinated rollout. But obviously he got asked the question, and the president was candid in his remarks and in his views. And as I said, he stated it 3 times now over the past several months.
Speaking of possible armed conflict with the PRC over Taiwan issue, the U.S. military has been working for years on the operation plans for such contingency. In your book, you talk about a war plan that has been constantly updated. So even though Washington has been intentionally vague about whether it will come to Taiwan's defense if Beijing attacked, the U.S. military is very clear about what to do at each stage of a Taiwan contingency. There is no ambiguity about that, right?
Well, the United States military prepares plans for any type of contingency around the world that may involve U.S. interests and could involve the United States military. So that's part and parcel of our day in, day out planning. Obviously, we've known since the relationship has changed, and obviously since the new turn that China has taken under Xi Jinping, that there is a possibility of conflict in the Taiwan Strait, and by the way, in the South China Sea and other parts of the world as well, with various other states. So you have to plan and be deliberate about it because that is the responsible thing to do.
About the plan, of course, it's classified. I assume you cannot review too much about it, but could you at least tell us if the plan, when you were in charge, of course, included sending troops to Taiwan? If so, under what circumstance?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't talk about DoD operational plans.
So let me ask you this way. According to a recent survey, over half of Taiwan residents do not believe the US would send troops in response to a Chinese attack. The share has doubled compared with before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What messages you would like to send to those people as a former US defense secretary?
Look, I think any country that's under threat from a neighbor or somebody else, first and foremost, should rely on themselves for their self-defense and not others to come to their aid. I've said publicly that I think Taiwan needs to do more to improve their defenses. I think they need to invest more of their GDP as a percentage into their defenses. I think they need to expand conscription, both in terms of the breadth and length. I think they need to look at different types of arms purchases to take on a more asymmetric defense, such as we've seen in Ukraine. So I think first and foremost, Taiwan needs to rely on Taiwan and not think that the United States or another country is going to come to its aid. Because in my view, a population that is organized and trained and equipped to push back against a bigger power is a far greater deterrent than leaving your fate to somebody else.
So in fact, there are other ways to defend Taiwan military against China's invasion without actually sending troops to Taiwan, right? For the US?
Well, there are many ways to defend. More importantly, there are many ways to deter, and so much of that depends really on the stance that China takes at the end of the day, is what does China plan to do and how do they plan to do it? And look, I would encourage Beijing, as I have over the years, to work with the government in Taipei and improve relationships and have discussions about these matters of concern to Beijing in a peaceful diplomatic manner and not threaten them with overflights of fighters and bombers and the sailing of warships into the waters.
I'm wondering, how urgent is it to have this kind of discussion? How do you see PRC's readiness to take over Taiwan by force?
Well, only the PRC military really knows. The PLA, People's Liberation Army, knows how ready they are, and but there's consequences, right? It's a risky proposition. They have to, depending on what their plans are, to do such a thing, and there are risks and there are consequences. And I think what Beijing has seen based on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that the consequences of a unwarranted Chinese assault or action against Taiwan could result in economic isolation, political isolation, and have a dramatic impact on the Chinese economy, to say the least.
As you've just pointed out, since Chinese President Xi Jinping took office, there has been a significant buildup of China's armed forces. In your book, you talk about China's development of land-based ballistic and cruise missiles. Do you find it particularly threatening to the U.S. and to Taiwan?
Well, every country has the right to defend itself. I just make a point of the fact that they have over 1,000 or so missiles on the mainland opposite Taiwan and other areas, and that's something if you're a planner you have to take into account. It's just a fact of a critical element, I think, of China's defense that has to be factored into those of us who are concerned about China's ascent.
You also mentioned that PLA's missile system were integral to China's anti-access or called area denial strategy for the Western Pacific. What's your assessment of the strategy of China? Why do you call it a major obstacle for the U.S. to overcome if we ended up in a conflict?
Well, it's been the view, and I think that China has stated it, that they want to control the waters within the 9-dash line. They claim it as territorial waters going back historically, but that uncovers waters and areas claimed by several other countries in the Western Pacific, from Vietnam and Indonesia to the Philippines to Japan and elsewhere. So they want to control that first 9-dash line, the first island chain, and clearly get out to the second island chain, which involves many Pacific Island countries, and control those waterways. And look, those waterways aren't for China to control, number one. Secondly, Chinese control of those waterways would have a dramatic impact on international trade and would affect many, many countries, not just in the region, but around the world. So look, I'll go back to the basics. I want to see a China that it continues to grow and thrive and prosper, but does so within current international rules and norms and frameworks, and doesn't try to break them or bend them or violate them. And we've seen too much of that over the past many years. And that's the issue we have.
So how would you compare the maritime capability between China and the US nowadays?
Well, in terms of capital ships, warships, I think the United States Navy is the best in the world, hands down. But China is growing its Navy in terms of size and capacity and capability. And it's something we have to be alert to. That's why I propose to modernize the United States military in both its size and capability in dramatic ways if we're going to continue to deter the PLA Navy from whatever plans they may have in the future.
Let's talk more about the specifics on this issue. Given the rising military capability of the PRC, what's the right way for Taiwan to build up its own defense? In your book, you mentioned that you pressed Taipei to spend more on the right mix of forces and weapons. What do you mean by right mix?
Well, I think it begins with building a capable territorial defense where as many of the 23 million Taiwanese people on the island know how to use a weapon or know how to defend their town, their community, their block, whatever the case may be, and they know how to organize if the PRC tries to seize the island. That would be number one. Number two, on the conventional military force, I think the Taiwanese military needs to make sure it has the capability to defeat an amphibious assault. That could include anti-ship cruise missiles and mines, but it also means the systems that we see, again, Ukraine using, such as anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, handheld weapons that would allow the Taiwanese people to fight in small groups in an insurgent mode, if you will, should the PLA invade.
That goes into the next question I would like to ask. There are reports about the Biden administration quietly pressing Taipei to order American-made missiles and smaller arms for asymmetric warfare, rather than weapons designed for conventional set-piece warfare. Do you think it's necessary?
Well, I'm not familiar with, I don't have any inside knowledge, if you will. I read what you probably read, but to me that makes sense, that there be a balanced approach, that it's not just high-end military equipment that's used by a professional military, but also other equipment that could be used by against smaller groups of professional soldiers or a militia or a territorial defense. I think it needs to be a balanced approach because, the PLA military is much, much bigger and capable than the Taiwanese military. So what you have to do is figure out how to create a deterrent force of 23 million Taiwanese that would make the possible seizure of Taiwan by the PLA very, very risky, very uncertain, and very, very bloody, if you will, should they pursue to do that.
I'm wondering how much of the strategy could be applicable to the U.S. When it comes to build up the U.S. military capability. As you've just mentioned, the Ukraine war has proved the superiority of anti-platform weapons. So some military experts have suggested the U.S. give up its platform-centric view and stop investing heavily in expensive platforms like battle tanks or aircraft. Do you agree?
I agree to some measure. You always need tanks on the modern battlefield. You always need, manned fighters. You always need some degree of manned ships. But for example, the naval force structure that I put forth in the fall of 2020 called Battle Force 2045 had much greater emphasis on a smaller distributed fleet of warships, many of them manned or optionally manned or unmanned to do that. Because I believe that the future is going to be in long-range precision weapons that don't require a platform to launch them, but rather could be launched from the mainland or somewhere else. So I think that is where history and technology is taking us.
Besides Taiwan, what are the other flashpoints that might lead to armed conflicts between the U.S. and China?
Well, if you just look in the Western Pacific, there are a number of areas. We talked about the Taiwan Strait. I think North Korea is a possibility. If the DPRK attacks the Republic of Korea, could that war broaden? Obviously the United States would get involved, as would Japan, maybe others. Then you have the South China Sea, where China has laid claim to any number of islands. And then you have every now and then these conflicts pop up in other parts of the South China Sea, whether it's between China and the Philippines or China and Indonesia, other places where their maritime militia is active, and they're trying to lay claim to different parts of the Western Pacific. So I think all those are flashpoints. So you can keep going around to, for example, the Himalayas with the Indians. We had a clash there in 2020 between the Indian military and the PLA. So if you look mostly around the periphery of China, at least in the south and east, you see a lot of areas where conflict could break out.
Given there are so many flashpoints, I believe it's your belief that it's very important for the two militaries to improve their communication to reduce the chances of miscalculations. As a defense secretary, you reached out early on to your Chinese counterpart and tried to maintain a pace of communication. You actually talked to Wei Fenghe multiple times. What's your impression of him?
Yes, you're right. I think it's very important that both countries talk, particularly countries that are competing with one another, as we were with China. And I thought it was important that we have that dialogue so that we could prevent misunderstandings, address misperceptions, resolve issues and conflicts and whatnot. So I reached out early on to Minister Wei to build that relationship. And we tried to talk every few months. And certainly if we were in the same place at the same time, we tried to meet. So for example, I think at an ASEAN meeting in Bangkok in 2019, we met. And so I think it's very important. He was affable and informed and willing to listen to me, and I listened to him. And we just tried to talk and keep that line of communication open, because I think it's important to build that during a non-contentious period, so that if something happens, that you at least have a level of trust and communication that will allow you to talk during difficult times.
In your book, you said you actually recognized that Wei Fenghe wasn't truly an equal when it came to authority and power in his own system, but he was your best point of entry. We know that China has constantly denied the requests of U.S. defense secretaries to speak to its highest ranking uniformed officer like General Xu Qiliang, right? So are you concerned about this?
Well, I'm concerned that there has not been a dialogue, or there was not a dialogue between the Pentagon and the Chinese military at the highest levels for some period of time. As I recall, Secretary Austin recently spoke with Minister Wei, Look, at the end of the day, it's we have differences in our organizations and rank structures. I was willing to talk to Minister Wei because I think it's important to have those lines of communication open. I would prefer to speak to my actual equivalent, but that wasn't the case. But it's better to speak to someone than no one.
Do you think it might reduce the effectiveness of, communication with the Chinese military?
Well, it could, but that's their decision. If something happens and there's a misunderstanding, then that's on them, not me. I try to reach to the right person, and as did Secretary Austin, and clearly the Chinese do not want that level of communication for some reason.
What would be your suggestions for the Biden administration to push forward the China focus, especially during the time when the Ukraine crisis seemed to take much of its attention and the resources?
Well, I think the president needs to have direct contact with his counterpart, Xi Jinping, to explain all of our concerns with China and its behavior, and look for areas not just to compete, but areas to cooperate where we might build some trust and build some bonds. But at the same time, you also have to increase the relationships between our allies and partners in the region, beginning with our bilateral alliances with, for example, Australia, the Philippines, Seoul, Korea, and Japan, and then work on the partnerships as well, whether it's Vietnam and Indonesia or Mongolia, and build that up and show American leadership in not just the military context, but also the diplomatic and economic and trade, so that we can stand firm and defend, again, the international rules-based order and norms that have really allowed countries around the world to prosper and thrive, and communities to grow now for 75 plus years.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for your time.
近期，大约500对夫妇在纽约的林肯中心广场上参加了一场象征性的婚礼。这些眷侣中，多数都是因为新冠疫情大流行的限制措施而被迫导致婚礼拖延。一起来看一看。
In our sorrows,
Just do a little bondage,
When we first started planning our summer programming, we thought, what does New York City need right now that Lincoln Center can provide? And so we knew we had all these beautiful outdoor spaces, and we thought, why don't we throw a wedding for all the people that had their weddings canceled over the pandemic? And here we are.
Yes, the wedding was delayed 1 year for us due to the pandemic, and we're here because we actually got engaged here at Lincoln Center, and so this is a very special place for us, and it's a place we spend a lot of time.
full circle moment.
It's important, especially, we're a same-sex couple. It's very important for us to come out and celebrate and show ourselves out here in public as much as we can.
its base should be upon a certain love. It's called mawadda in Arabic.
Mazel tov, everyone.
New York is invincible. Nothing can ever destroy our spirit. Nothing can ever destroy our love for each other, and nothing will be able to destroy the love you have for the person you have determined you're going to spend your life with.
感谢您收看今天的节目，我们明天再见。
观众朋友们好，欢迎收看美国之音的时事大家谈，我是许波。中共宣传系统开足马力，为习近平20大的权力。